Let me tell you about a former student of mine. His name was Eli. One day, a few semesters back, we had discussed on the first day of class about the importance of attendance in my class. I was certain that to be successful, that attendance was vital to that success. Well, Eli ended up missing the majority of the classes that semester, and in fact, he didn't show up again until the final exam. After grading the final exams, I discovered that Eli got a 95%. I was, of course, very skeptical and suspect that Eli must have cheated in some way or another. When I handed the exams back, I wrote in big red letters on his tests, "Please see me after class." After class was over, he came over to my desk and said, "You wanted to see me?" I asked him, "How did you earn a 95% on your final exam?" His response changed my perspective of the impact I was actually having on my students. He said, "Well, I would have earned 100%, but I went to the first class and I got confused." Now, this story is not entirely true, but the point remains that as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, we as educators need to step back and take a serious look at how we teach. I had the opportunity to see how the coronavirus impacted education through 3 different sets of eyes. I was in a unique role where I was a part of my school's administration team. I was teaching 3 career and technical education classes. And as a parent of 2 children, one who is typical and one who is autistic, I had the opportunity to see how other teachers and organizations dealt with all of these challenges. Through this process, I discovered 3 things. The first being that engagement by the student is critical to their success. Second, that teaching a hands-on type of class virtually is just shy of impossible if we as educators are not open to change. But I discovered that it can be done with some modification, some sacrifice, and actually by flipping the classroom. The third is that if schools aren't prepared to take on these challenges, programs and schools will fail as a result. Let me share some of the perspectives and experiences I had in the midst of this pandemic. As a member of the administration team, our first priority was the safety of our students. As a result, months earlier, when rumors of the coronavirus were starting to trickle into the media, we as an administration team had a very short what-if conversation about what we would do if we needed a plan B. I have to admit, that was the first time I ever heard of something called Zoom. Little did I know at the time how important that little conversation would be. Within 1 week of schools across the state closing, we are already engaged in virtual learning. It wasn't pretty, and by no means was it perfect. We were still able to press on. By having a plan, we were in a very good position to finish out the school year. We were surprised at the initial number of students that attended classes during those first few weeks. We had over 94% of students showing up to class across the district. Kids were simply showing up. As a teacher, teaching 3 different CTE classes, I was happy that students were showing up those first couple of weeks. But I quickly noticed a drop in student participation in regard to them turning in our work. This quickly became the concern of almost every teacher that I knew. How do I get my students to take ownership of their education and engage in class? Now, admittedly, this has always been a concern to some degree, but never to this level. As a parent, I saw both ends of the spectrum in regard to this in my own home. On one hand, I had a kid who I would catch doing extra math because she didn't want to fall behind. And on the other hand, I had a kid who literally had to be threatened with loss of privileges to get him to do anything. And to be transparent, there was a fair amount of yelling and frustration on both our parts. The difference between the 2 of them is that one child was intrinsically motivated, and the other one has not made the connection yet to the role that education was playing in his life. So, you might be asking yourself, how do you get kids to engage and take ownership of their learning in a virtual environment? I can tell you how I approached it in my different roles. As administrator, I took an overall holistic approach with my team and focused my energy on encouraging my teachers to focus more on the relationships with their students. I would tell them that they can't expect excellence from their students until they have equity in them. That's a little reference to Dr. James Knight, Equity and Excellence in the Classroom. Meaning that they needed to seek to understand their students and their situations before you can expect them to reciprocate the level of passion and energy you have for your classes. I would also encourage them to make their assignments manageable and to the point, Cut out the fluff. And lastly, you need to make yourself available to them. Find a safe way to make yourself accessible to your students if they need help. As a teacher, these strategies allowed me to discover that I had students who didn't have access to resources at home, or that they had a parent who maybe lost their job and was out of work, and that they as a student needed to go to work to help make ends meet for their family. Or in many cases, is that they were now the primary caregiver for their siblings or an elderly family member. Armed with this information, I was able to meet their individual needs of my students. In several cases, it was simply a matter of having to deliver resources to that student or just being flexible with them. As always, communication is the key to success in these matters. As a parent, it was simply a matter of myself being engaged with my kids' learning. The time that I sat down to work alongside with my son were actually very productive. And in my son's case, we noticed a huge jump in his reading comprehension in this time that we had together. But like I said, it took us actively sitting down and engaging along with him. And I feel that some of my students need that same level of attention in their own homes if they're going to continue with virtual learning. The second thing that I learned was that as a career and technical education teacher who teaches hands-on project-based classes, that I would have to get creative on how I was going to teach some of these concepts. The idea in a CTE classroom is that over 50% of the class time is dedicated to creating and doing. So teaching virtually was a unique challenge. The solution to this situation was to flip the classroom. Normally, I would talk about the concepts through direct instruction, and then I would model to the students how to do it. I would then use class time for them to go and actually do it themselves, essentially show me. I basically use the same philosophy in the virtual classroom, but instead of dedicating our time together to any of these things I normally would do, I use our time together to connect and be available for questions. So all of the other parts of the class were delivered virtually. The students received a recorded lecture, a demonstration tutorial, and resources to complete the project long before we ever met. And the virtual time we had together was dedicated to answering their questions and just making connections. As with any class, the key to success was communication, and also by putting checkpoints in place to track their progress and understanding of those concepts. To say it was challenging would be an understatement, but I discovered it could be done, and it was my experience that it fostered better results in many cases because the students can now control when and where they decided to do their work. It gave them the power to take ownership of their learning rather than holding them hostage for 8 hours a day and forcing them to engage. The third thing that I learned through this experience was that how we as educators need to change. There are millions of parents around the world that discovered one of two things about educating their children through this pandemic. They either learned that they do have the ability to homeschool their children, or that they greatly undervalue what teachers really do day to day, and that teaching is actually very hard work. Regardless of their epiphany, it is my prediction that virtual learning, or virtual school, will be a part of the educational landscape moving forward. And if schools are not prepared to meet this challenge head on, then programs will fail. As someone who's gone through this experience as an administrator, teacher, and as a parent, it would be my recommendation to every teacher and parent across America to do a little forward thinking and actually have a plan in place before the next school year starts. Teachers, consider flipping your classroom and using your class time to invest in your students in different ways. Remember, you must have equity in your students long before you have excellence from them. Parents, you should know that delivering content is a lot easier than actually creating it. If you're thinking about homeschooling, have a plan on where you're going to get your content long before you make that decision. The simple fact is that education is changing, and it is our responsibility as educators to change along with it. The three things we need to keep in mind moving forward is that you need to encourage, you need to engage with your students if you expect them to engage with you. Consider adding a virtual element to your classroom and flipping it to better meet the lives of your students and the changing environment of technology. And lastly, embrace the challenge and be a risk taker. Your ability to adapt to that change might be the difference in you succeeding or failing as an educator in the 21st century. Thank you for your time.